I only know one of the speakers, but Will Schroeer. But they're all really smart guys, and have very impressive bios. And the bios are on the back of the agenda sheet that you would have received when you came in here. So I'm gonna make this very, very quick so we have more time for questions and answers. I'll introduce all three of them. Dr. Julian Marshall is a co-author of the Center for Transportation Studies, A Smaller Carbon Footprint. One thing I noticed in his bio is that he has been a planning consultant for more than 100 cities and counties throughout Minnesota. That's very impressive. As I said before, I know Will Schroeer is a friend from way back. He was on the Transportation Land Use Technical Working Group. He was the lead on the Minnesota Climate Change Advisory Group. This I didn't know about him. He won some very impressive awards. I received the 1996 National Planning Award from APA and 2 EPA Service Awards. He's also a nice guy. And the third speaker is John Shardlow, co-project lead of the University of Minnesota's Minnesota Statewide Conservation and Preservation Plan, and he is a scientist engineer who has degrees in mechanical engineering. He's the engineer on the panel, including degrees from Princeton University. So with that, we're going to take one after another after another.
So our bios in the back. Actually, I think I'm the engineer among the group.
Oh no.
That's okay. That's right. I will.
And I'm the one with 100 cities and counties.
Oh no. You didn't have to do that.
I wasn't sure whether engineer was used as a compliment or an insult, so just in case it was an insult, I wanted to make sure it was directed my way. The bios in the back, again, I'm Julian Marshall. I'm a professor in the civil engineering department and also with a joint appointment here in urban and regional planning. My research looks at environmental impacts of transportation, including land use effects. So I wanted to start this morning with a brief story. This is, land use and transportation environment is my area of research. It's a story from when I was in graduate school. I was studying this topic, and one day I came upon a paper that did the following analysis. What would happen if everybody in the US who lives within 2 or 3 miles from their work switched from driving to walking or biking? And of course, there are quite large impacts, both on the environmental side and then also to public health, because you'd have many more people getting appropriate daily exercise. So I thought this was kind of an interesting article. I brought this into my advisor. I showed it to him. He happened to be one of the people who lived within 2 or 3 miles from his work, and he was currently driving, and he saw this benefit both to the environment and also to him personally, and that one article was enough to get him to switch. Wow. And since then, he has been a regular walker or biker. He goes back and forth. So I mentioned that story not only as an example of the quirky decision-making processes of engineering faculty, but also because it's a story of tipping points. And I think when we look at land use and the way that people interact with the built environment, this is very much a story of tipping points where modest modifications sometimes can have a large impact on people's activity. So you heard in the previous session a lot of information connecting the built environment to how far we drive and to our emissions. And here's one example of that kind of information. This is showing for cities across the US how as you go to denser and denser cities, you see reduced vehicle miles traveled. That's what you'd expect. Of course, there's a fair amount of scatter up there in the data, but the general downward trend, as you just heard, is quite clear. I wanted to start with 2 news stories about this topic. One is from one of my favorite news sources, The Onion. hope you're all familiar with Onion. They did some serious investigative reporting. They did a survey and found that 98% of U.S. commuters favor public transportation for others. And then they announced that there would be a new campaign to try to increase ridership. The slogan of this would be, "Take the bus, I'll be glad you did." So that's one view on mass transit. Getting a little bit old now. This is from the year 2000. And then a more recent view, something published quite recently on NPR, they reported that alternative travel modes, so bus ridership, carpooling, and even bicycling, are up this winter. That's impressive just on the winter fact alone, and also despite the drop in gas prices. And the levels are quite significant. Metro transit ridership has stayed at its highest level in 25 years. So I think one question that many people are asking is whether these current data that are rolling in, whether that is merely a minor blip that will have forgotten about in 5 years from now, or whether this is the beginning of a drastic change like what we just heard about. Much of my research is looking at what would be the environmental impacts of those different scenarios. So in the brief time I have here, I want to talk about two things. The first one, the bulk of my talk will be on a study we did here at University of Minnesota through the Center for Transportation Studies, looking at transportation greenhouse gas emissions within Minnesota and some different scenarios for how that would play out. And at the end, I'll just make a few comments about other environmental impacts in addition to greenhouse gas emissions that we might care about and which are influenced by land use decisions. So just some brief background on this study. It was funded by the Minnesota legislature. They came to the Center for Transportation Studies here at University of Minnesota. CTS then put together an interdisciplinary team. I was one of the principal investigators with other people from engineering and here from the Humphrey Institute. Essentially, we were looking at different scenarios over time and how would the emissions respond to different policy options. Let me just acknowledge and thank Representatives Hortman and Hornstein for their guidance and feedback through this process. That was quite helpful, and we appreciate it, as well as technical assistance provided by several people in state agencies, and especially data. That's always helpful for doing these studies. They give us lots of data. And this study followed the Next Generation Energy Act passed in 2007, wherein the governor proposed and the legislature adopted a series of goals for how our state would reduce our emissions going forward into the future. And here's what those goals are. Relative to 2005 levels, we aim to reduce our state's emissions by 15% by 2015, and then so on, 30% by 2025. So the process that we went through for the legislature was intended to complement a similar process being done by a group working for the governor, and you'll hear about that in the next talk. Two key differences between those groups. One is that ours was based here at the University of Minnesota only, whereas the MCAG process for the governor was based on stakeholder input. And the second difference is that we focused specifically on transportation, whereas MCAG had a broader scope and they looked at all emission sources, not just transportation. Within the law, it says that the emissions will be reduced by these amounts, but it doesn't say which sectors of the economy will have to reduce by which amounts. So for the purpose of setting a goal and seeing whether we could meet it, we assumed that each sector would have to reduce proportional to its current emissions. That is, we assumed that transportation would need to meet these percent reductions. For today, I'm going to focus on topics relevant to this conference, on-road gasoline vehicles, which are about 2/3 of the transportation emissions in this state, and then specifically land use actions that can influence those emissions. We used a standard model for this approach, which is called LEAP, which stands for Long Range Energy Alternatives Planning. And basically that allows us to look over time at how the emissions would change depending on different policy actions. This is the guts of the model. The core of the model is this analytic equation where we see the emissions are estimated as the product of three terms. The first term is the fuel consumption in gallons per mile. So that's the reciprocal of miles per gallon that we're quite familiar with. The second term is carbon content of the fuel. That is carbon content or greenhouse gas emissions per gallon of fuel. And this is life cycle emissions, so it's starting at the well or refinery and all the way bringing that